Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and this short little series of videos that I've used to document my progress and project of creating a box for the Dreadbox Dysphonia Eurorack modular synth voice without any pre-patching. And of course, the fact that it isn't pre-patched has made this project a lot easier. I'll get back to that. So my starting point was I wanted to have a case for the Dysphonia, and I also wanted to double up the patch points to move them away from the controls, the knobs and the sliders, because I feel it gets so cramped with cables here that it gets in the way of my actual performance with the synth. In addition to that, I want to use it to interface with my Kilpatrick phenol system synthesizers that use banana jacks. And so the combination of those things meant I wanted a box with room for extra patch points, and the extra patch point would be banana jack. And this is what I've done. I was first thinking of creating a box from scratch, which would have been quite easy, and I was planning to make it a sort of wide rectangular thing with the patch bay on the right, which is the usual thing now for semi-modulars, like the Dreadbox ones as well, and of course Moog. But then it turned out I had this vintage 50-year-old teak box from a probably some kind of educational decade resistor box. It's even got a registration number here, which probably is the number used for the insurance for the school or university or wherever it was that it has been used. And I'll put that deliberately on the front now because it's part of the history of the box and I wanted to show that off. And once I had the box and I had the dimensions of the box, then I tried to design how I would fit in all my sockets. And it turned out that this was a very good size to get decent spacing between all these. The height between these sockets is about the same as the closest ones on the phenol. The space from side to side is decent. And I also made room for the USB power jack to be on the top. So there's nothing sticking out of the sides of this box, which makes it easy to cram in together with other gear when I'm doing my setups to do a little jam. For my sockets, I chose banana sockets that actually are binding posts. So the top screws off like so, and you can put on a spade jack or a ring connector, and you can tighten that again, which means it is possible for me now to actually create a kind of semi-modular approach as well, where I can create little cables on the ring jacks going from one to the other patch point. Most likely I will not do this, and as you can see, I actually removed the tops from all of these jacks now apart from one, and the reason is that these jacks, or these things at the top, they are quite wide. So when I put this down here, for instance, of course now you can see it from the top view, you can see that behind this jack now it says trig. But I can't see it from my angle, so if I were to see the labels properly, I would either have to remove all of these, or I would have to prop it up about 45 degrees, and then of course you can't see them. In the end, I decided I would remove all of these. I'm keeping one, and that's for the ground connection. The reason is I want the ground connection to stand out a little bit because that is so important to use before you start playing, or it can be really important because as long as there is no audio connection from a grounded jack like these Eurorack sockets here to the other synthesizer I'm using, the phenol, then they need to share the common voltage reference, and the only way to do that is to connect the grounds together, and I'm doing that with this jack here. easy to forget when you're doing these kinds of modifications. So an important little thing. When you're modifying something to banana jack, you have to make sure there's a way to connect the the chassis grounds, the common voltage reference together between your equipment, because the jacks themselves only carry one signal. They do not carry ground, unlike the Eurorack sockets. And then I printed this front panel on my printer on a poster board. I sort of reasonably tried to match the colors a little bit. But the most important thing for me was to match the font. So the font used for my labels here is exactly the same as the one used by Dreadbox. And the reason, the way I found it was to take a little piece of text and put it into a font search engine, and that gave me only one correct result, and of course that was the one that I wanted, and it's a free font, brilliant. And I downloaded it and used it for my labels, matched the size, the color a little bit different, but I actually don't mind that. That's not so important, I think. The colors go together, that's the main thing. After printing this, the print is very fragile. I mean, if you scratch it, it gets scratches very easily. So in addition to printing it, I also put on 2 layers of PVA glue, just regular wood glue, basically. It's white when you apply it, but of course it dries clear. And then I attached it to the box, and I'm using the original nicely aged bronze or brass screws that were used for the panel that was on top here, Bakelite panel presumably, and I'm using those to attach these, so they got that nice vintage look, and they match the box. And of course I'll show you the underside now, because it's just removing the bottom circuit board there so I can show you. It wasn't meaning for it to fall off right away. So of course the synth is here, but then the rest is a piece of wood that I cut to match the shape of the synthesizer and the shape of the box. I made it a little bit thick. If I made it a little bit thinner, but just by a millimeter or two, this part of the job would have been a lot easier doing all this wiring, but it was just enough that I was able to squeeze these nuts on. So just to show you what I've done here. So now the power, the way I'm moving the power from the USB power on the side of the synth to the top of the panel is with an extension cable. So it's a type B to type A extension cable. And for the hole here for the USB, I just first I drilled it out, and then I used file to make it gradually bigger, and then to the point where I could just squeeze the socket in, and it would just stay there all by itself. For all the other connections now, before I even started doing the wiring, I numbered them. So I would take, of course they follow a similar kind of pattern to what it is on the synth. I would make sure that socket number 1 here is matched, and I would sort of find the correct one on the panel, and I would write a little number 1 on. I'm not sure if you can see that though, but there is a little number 1 next to the one that belongs to that. I did that for all the connectors, and that means I don't have to move back and forth when I'm doing the wiring, and it's also less likely that I will make any mistakes. As for the wiring, the signal on these on the Eurojack or the mini jack connectors is on the viewed from below. It's on the right pin is the signal, and the left pin from below here is the ground connection. So I wired all these wires with a little ring connector at the end to the right pins of all the connection points that I wanted. There were some connection points I didn't need, and that is the multiple, first of all, because with banana jacks, each output becomes its own multiple. You don't need to add a passive mult, which is one of the really practical things about banana jacks. because they're all stackable. You just stack. You can stack the outputs as much as you want. Inputs, on the other hand, you don't want to stack too much, because then you could get too much voltage going into a certain place. Right, so I soldered all these in, and I did sort of in batches, so I wouldn't sort of first did this bit, and then I did this bit, and then I did that bit at the end. First soldering on these points here, and then I put the ring connectors on with the nuts, and of course I had to work a little bit hard now because there isn't much to go on. There's not much thread sticking up from the panel for me to attach it to. One of the tricks there is that before I put on the connectors, I always put on the nuts on all the jacks, and by tightening them, you're actually pulling the connector into the wood a little bit and making that distance a little bit smaller, so that when you want to attach the connector, that's when you loosen the nut, put on the connector, put the nut back on, and you will have squeezed it just a little bit, making that job a little bit easier. Ground connection, in order to have a little bit of redundancy, this one's got 2 cables, as you can see, and I've attached it to 2 different ground connection pins. The reason being, of course, it's important to keep the ground connection. I wanted a little bit of redundancy, so I thought I'll just attach it to 2 points rather than 1, so that the chance of failure is going to be so much smaller. And that's generally what's happening here on the underside here. This box now is a little bit uneven. It doesn't seem to be a problem, but if it becomes a problem, there are 2 things I can do. I can, of course, plane it out a little bit so it is perfectly even. Secondarily, I was thinking I could also just attach a little block of wood in the corner here, and then I can put on rubber feet. At the moment, the rubber feet I have, I can't put them on this piece here because it will stick out, and that won't look nice. It has to be underneath, so I would have to put in a little piece of wood for the corners first, and of course I can adjust where I put those pieces of wood to match the height perfectly, and use that to make sure it is perfectly plain after that. But I think I'm going to be fine without it. So I'm just going to put this back on again now. First of all, I'm attaching the power, because it's very hard to do. The box is in the way for you to do it when it is in place. And of course this lines up with these standoffs, like so. Let's see, I just have to make sure I'm getting this there, and make sure these pin connectors are lined up perfectly. Something that feels like it's resisting a little bit there. Not sure what that is. Is that the cables now that's been... There are no connectors on that side, I don't think. It's all... yeah, it's just there, isn't it? So that will be fine. And then I use the standoffs here. Now, the cable I used for the connectors in here is a single wire, which means that it's sometimes a little bit more of a hassle to work with. It has its pros and cons. They're quite stiff. That also means you can just shape them a little bit as well. So that can be an advantage. They're not soft like the multi-strand ones. But that also means that it reveals very easily when you have a bad solder, because when you start moving them about, and if they then come loose from the solder point, you know that you have to redo that solder point. And if you watched my time lapse, you would have noticed that did happen quite a bit actually. I had to redo several of them just to be sure that until they were properly attached. So I think actually that's in many ways more of a pro. Now it does cause a little bit of trouble sometimes when you have to squeeze it into a tight space like here now between these panels. It's not ideal, but it's let's see, let's get this one on as well. but it's fine. You can still shape them rather well to what you need them to do. So there we are. That will do. That doesn't have to be on. This corner doesn't have to be on fully. And then make sure that everything is within the box there, and I can turn it around, and now it is ready to play. You can see it's a little bit uneven, not a big problem. So now the great advantage now of doing it this way is I can do all my patching, like here from the oscillator to the VCA, for instance, and then from the modulator to the CV or the VCA, etc. I can do that away from these controls. But in addition, I can, of course, also create multiples by just stacking an output and taking it somewhere else. And also I can stack inputs, but I have to be more careful, of course, to make sure that it doesn't get too high a voltage. I can also in parallel use this patch panel. If I want to, I can use both at the same time. They're just now, the sockets are just parallel now, so I can do whatever is most convenient. As long as I only have a few cables down here, they're not in the way, so I can still combine those two things. If I want to patch this with external gear that is Euro-rackable, using mini jacks, I can use these connectors down here and take that out to somewhere else. If I'm using it with my phenol synth, I'm going to take a cable from my phenol and it's going to come in over here from the outside, and of course always making sure before doing anything else to connect the grounds together. And yeah, it just works really well. When I take the audio out from this, I just use a mini jack cable to a sort of 1/4-inch jack. I got a few of those so that I can just patch in wherever I want to take the audio out, usually from the mixer, from the echo, or from the filters. It works really well. It's a very nice synth voice. It's compact, it's cheap, or certainly it was cheap if you bought the kit. It's a lot of functionality for the money, and it's a very good synth. But I think now with this expansion it became a little bit better because it adds a little bit of flexibility both in patching, in performing on it, adjusting things while you play, which is what I like to do. I don't like to just set things and then I play it with something else so much. I want to have that hands-on experience, especially working the filters, because two different filters and you can use them together in clever ways. It's a really interesting feature, and one of the things that in itself, just that filter section, I think is worth the whole price of the Dysphonia for me. It's amazing. So and that's it really. And a small disadvantage, by the way, of having removed these plastic tops. When you have this plastic top on your banana jack, your patch cable just sort of leads into the socket. Here, on the other hand, you could more easily miss it. You have to be a little bit more precise. Not a big deal. Another advantage to having these naked sockets here now is that I can create a connection just by touching this one and touching this one. I now made a connection. I can do it like this, and I use the resistance and capacitance now of my skin to create a slightly imperfect connection. It makes a little noise, that's quite interesting sometimes to play around with. I can also make a connection just by touching a connector, which of course you can't do with the mini jacks, because the first connection that is made on the mini jack is for your signal to short to ground as you put it in, and when it's fully in, that's when you get the signal connection. That's another advantage of the banana jacks. You can actually play it like this just by touching the connectors, and that's quite a brilliant thing. So this is the end of this particular project. I would call it a success. I haven't had any problems at all doing this. I haven't had any. Everything worked as I was doing it. Everything was fine right away, because I'll just make sure that I just double check and redo my solders as I'm working on it, rather than checking them afterwards. I did have a little look around with my multimeter, also part of the time-lapse video, and I did notice there were some of these modules seem to have, because I was checking resistance between, and of course when you check resistance to see if things are correct, basically what I do was I take two of the same connectors. So I've got the CV, the low pass filter CV and the low pass filter CV, and I connect the signal here and this one to the multimeter, and if it says 0, that means it is fine. But what I did find was that some of these modules, for instance, now if I still have the CV input of the low pass filter and I go to the output of the LFO, then some of these inputs actually showed that they were connected in some way with high resistance, which means that there is something that is perhaps a little bit, there's some short circuits that are, well, not very short because it's very high resistance, as you're talking hundreds of thousands up to megohms. But I don't know if that's something that happened when I soldered it the first time. Probably is, because I don't think that would have happened when I did this project. Whatever the case is, it doesn't seem to affect functionality, and so I chose just to ignore it. But I am aware that there is something here that looks like there are connections that maybe shouldn't be there. I'm not sure how that exactly works. So never mind that, it works fine and it sounds great, and I think also it looks quite fine. One thing I didn't actually calculate with, now you see the panel is a little bit sort of duller in color now than it should have been, and the reason is that I started doing the drilling and the sanding and the filing while just after, the next day after I put on the glue, the PVA glue, to varnish the front plate. The problem with that is that the glue is dry, but it isn't set. Technically, it takes at least 3 days, and it's sort of cured after 2 weeks, which means that tiny particles of sawdust sort of stick to the surface, and they don't really come off that easily. And that's given it a little bit of that dull look. I don't mind, to be honest. It looks a bit rough, and that's all right. Little bit rough. It's sort of a in between, very stylish and fancy and rough and ready. So I don't mind that. Also, the USB jack here is a little bit askew. I don't mind that either. It's quite tight in there and it does the job well. So the case itself, I think the wood bit, of course, also a little bit rough, but I think it just has that character that I really like. And I'm going to do more projects like this because I also have other things that I need to put in the box and get some extensions for. I'm going to get back to that. I'm also going to create, because I've been sort of on and off a little bit about when I'm doing synth DIY, about expanding the phenols with attenuators, and I've been doing it in different ways. And also I did make a case for my Kilpatrick phenols, but the problem with that case was that while it was a good angle for me to play it, it's not a good angle for me to video it, and that is the problem. So I'm going to make a desk case that where the phenols lie flat. So there's one here, and then there's one here that's a little bit higher up, so that I can use the plugs on the back of the lower one. And then I will have to add some kind of attenuation, and that might actually be space for that in between, as a little angled panel between the two that I might do. So that might be my next project. And also I'm thinking of expanding my Zoya a little bit to make it easier to use the expansion port on the Zoya, for instance. So exciting things ahead. Now, I do apologize for anyone who's been waiting for Fighting Fantasy videos or anything else last week. This project took up too much time and that got precedence. I wanted to finish it, but I will be back with Fighting Fantasy this week. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this, found this interesting, entertaining, or useful. Maybe this is something you have plans to do yourself. If so, then yeah, good luck. It's great fun to do stuff like this. It's good practice for soldering and a little bit of woodworking and things. Yeah, highly recommended. So, goodbye for now. I'll see you later.